Welcome to the Utah State University Quinney College of Natural Resources NR6940 Lecture Series, Introduction to Remote Sensing. My name is Christopher McGinty. I'll be narrating these slides, and you can reach out to me at chris.mcginty@usu.edu with questions or comments. Topics for this lecture include geography and why it is important, thinking spatially, geographic information systems, and remote sensing. So why is geography important? The simplest answer to that is everything happens somewhere. And what do I mean by that? Well, for example, natural disasters such as earthquakes or hurricanes have a major spatial component. They have a spot where they occur or impact. Grazing or land management has a significant spatial impact. Urban planning, wildfire or emergency management, and the study of climate change all have major geographic components or are based on some geography. Watching the slides and images as they advance on the right, you can see the Great Salt Lake, located in northern Utah, from 1985 to 2011. As the images advance, captured by Landsat 5 and 7 sensors, you can see that this lake contracts and expands through time, but the general trajectory is to contract. Why is this information important? Well, it helps understand what's going on within the context of the lake itself and how the contraction of the lake might impact the economic or local environment around Utah. So understanding where helps us explain how and why. The study of geography itself is both physical and human, so there's two general components. Human geography is the study of people and how they interact with their environment and with each other, while physical geography is really the study of Earth's landscapes, events, places, environments, phenomena, and how they relate and spatially influence one another. Both types of geographies help us understand by learning to think and understand spatial meanings and relationships. Thinking spatially was defined by the Natural Resource Council in 2006 as thinking that finds meaning in the shape, size, orientation, location, direction, or trajectory of objects, processes, or phenomena. Each of these objects, processes, or phenomena have some sort of spatial component and really helps us understand our infinitely complex world. Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, are systems that are designed to capture, store, analyze, manage, and present complex geographic data. These systems really allow us to better understand an infinitely complex system of many interactions using geographic or spatial data, therein spatial thinking. So take a look at this image for just a moment. This was taken from Google. It's an off-nadir shot, meaning that it's shot at a slight oblique angle. And we're looking out from the very western edge of Wyoming into Idaho. What are some of the components there that you can see in the image? Well, if we break things apart, we can see rivers, lakes, cities, and topography, to name a few. GIS allows us to take this infinitely complex picture that we saw in this slide and separate out different layers and see how those layers interact or contrast with one another. When we use GIS, there's two types of spatial data. Those data include vector and raster. Vector data are data that represents geospatial features using points, lines, or polygons, and that vector data is usually described by an attribute of some type. Attribute data are data that describe properties of a vector data. For example, the fire hydrant in the bottom left of your screen has a spatial location. That spatial location tells us where the fire hydrant is, but doesn't tell us much else about it. Attribute data, non-spatial data, can really describe that point in space. For example, that fire hydrant is red. Its last fix was in 2003. It might need to be serviced. It has a flow rate, and at the time it did not need repair. So we now know the spatial location and we know the attribute data that gives us some non-spatial components, which makes that data even more powerful. Raster data, on the other hand, represents geospatial features through a series of grid cells or pixels. The example I like to use here is if you take a picture with your cell phone or any digital camera and you zoom in a long ways, as far as you can, what happens to that picture? Ultimately, it starts to look like the diagram on the right. It becomes very pixelated. Each one of those pixels are called cells, and each one of those cells represents a spatial location in your image, or if it's a satellite image or an aerial photo or something generated by a remote sensing instrument, a spot on the surface of the Earth. So raster data represents geospatial features through a series of grid cells or pixels. For example, satellite imagery or aerial photography collected through remote sensing or other activities is raster data. So let's talk a little bit about remote sensing. Get into the basics, and then we'll start moving to more advanced topics in future lectures. Remote sensing is collecting and interpreting data and information about the environment and the surface of the Earth from a distance, meaning that you're not actually physically in touch with that surface when you're observing it. Remote sensing are measurements of energy, generally speaking, that are reflected, transmitted, or absorbed, or some combination thereof. In this slide, on the left, you can see a picture from NASA using the MODA sensor of the Great Basin, including the Great Salt Lake in the upper right, Lake Tahoe in California down to the left. On the bottom right, using that same data, Utah State University was able to predict the growth and impact of invasive species across parts of Utah. Now, data and information are two different things. When we look at remote sensing, oftentimes we're looking at raw data. Raw data is something that might be captured by some sensor, and information is a product of that data that has been evaluated, interpreted, and derived somehow from the raw, remotely sensed data. A brief history about remote sensing. Remote sensing has really been around since the mid-1800s, at least generally speaking, using photographs. Satellite-based remote sensing has been available since the 1960s, starting with U.S. government and Soviet government programs. And along the bottom there you can see some of the images early using birds with cameras attached to them, or Nader in his balloon taking pictures of buildings and landscapes, SR-71 plane used for reconnaissance, and finally the bottom right, Landsat 8, which is the current sensor that we use quite often from the USGS and NASA. So another question for you. Why is this leaf green? So you think back to your class on plants, and why would this leaf appear to us as green? Well, before we start talking about why the leaf is green itself, let's talk a little bit more about the electromagnetic spectrum. Electromagnetic energy is energy that moves through space at the speed of light, but at different wavelengths or frequencies. Now, we can generate some of that electromagnetic energy, say radio waves or microwaves, or even X-rays, but the primary source of energy that we use as remote sensors comes from the sun. Now, when we talk about wavelengths, if we look at the graphic in the middle, wavelengths, for example, radio waves, can be the size of big buildings or even miles long, whereas gamma rays can be very, very small. Humans can only use a very small amount of the electromagnetic spectrum. That is, we only, with our eyes, see a very, very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and that's called the visible light, which is about 375 to 750 or 800 nanometers. So if you were to take a dollar bill and lay it flat on the table and pull out one hair from your head and lay it on that dollar bill, that's effectively the amount of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can see with our eyes. So back to why the leaf is green. Well, because of photosynthesis and chlorophyll, the various processes that are going on in the leaf, chlorophyll absorbs both the red and the blue while reflecting the green. So you'll see green with your eye, but as you move through the season and get into the fall and photosynthesis ceases, then the leaf starts to change color to our visible eye. So let's talk a little bit about energy. The principal form of energy detected by remote sensing systems is the product of the Earth's nearest star, which is the Sun. So passive remote sensing, or passive data collection, really means that there's no human input of energy into the system. We're simply flying some sort of sensor over an object that is capturing the reflection of electromagnetic energy from some other source, generally sun generated. Now active remote sensing, or active systems, mean that the human is inputting energy into the system for the purpose of collecting some other information. That could be a radio wave, a LiDAR or sonar, or it could be an X-ray. We'll talk a little bit about mapping change. So this is something we'll get into as we move into the lectures further. This is an image taken on June 5th, 2007 in central Utah. The star at the bottom of the image is just north of Milford, Utah. 8 days later, after a lightning strike just north of Milford, the Milford Flat Fire had burned 363,000 acres, and it was recorded as the largest wildfire in the state of Utah. It was so large that it spanned almost 80 kilometers or 50 miles in those 8 days, and unfortunately took several lives. The importance of remote sensing here is that you can see that the boundary of the fire was identified, and land managers were immediately able to get out on the landscape after this intense fire had run its course and began reseeding and replanting areas to ensure that topsoil would not blow away and that livestock and wildlife would have forage in the coming years. But what about what we can't see? So what about the rest of this electromagnetic spectrum? So we see this little tiny section of visible light. We can use it to do some basic change detection or mapping. But what about what we can't see? Well, let's take a look at this slide here. If you look at this slide, basically what you're seeing is a space heater. And it looks like any old space heater that you might find at a surplus store. And this might be plugged in or it might not be. From this perspective, it looks like reaching down and grabbing it really wouldn't be a problem. However, if we take another camera, a thermal camera, we point it at this space heater, we can see that indeed it is actually quite hot, and you wouldn't want to grab it and pick it up and carry it away. So down below, at the point in the middle of the image, you can see that that's 302.5 degrees Fahrenheit, where the spot on top of the space heater, where it would be safe to grab, is 77.7 degrees Fahrenheit. So you'd really want to avoid touching that if possible. Another example is this truck. Take a look at the image and think about what's going on here. These are all types of energy that we cannot necessarily see with our own eyes, but we can use other sensors, other types of remote sensing to identify different components, different types of energy in the image. So this truck, as you can see, has a warm tailpipe. It looks like the engine has recently been run. So take a quick look at this image and look closely and tell me if you can see the ducks. This is a really good example of using remote sensing to identify wildlife. If you don't look closely, you really can't see the ducks. It's overcast, it's slightly dark, it's a winter scene. But if you take a thermal camera, suddenly you can actually identify that there's something out there that is quite warm. So if we back up one, now you can kind of see where those ducks are. And we use that thermal camera, and it really identifies what's going on the landscape in an entirely different way, using different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. So, in sum, let's just talk a little bit about what we've learned today. We've talked about what geospatial is and why geography is important. We've talked a bit about why spatial thinking is critical to understanding our complex world. We've also discussed and summarized why GIS is an incredible tool to understand our complex world, and the difference between data and information, and how we can use data to generate informative information, and generally through the use of remote sensing, collecting data and understanding how the electromagnetic spectrum itself can really help inform what's happening on the ground. In future lectures, we'll start to break these items apart, and we'll begin to talk about them in depth so that we can better understand how remote sensing works.